Welcome to the One Giant Podcast, a sportscast all new football giant. Live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning on Sportscaster, bringing balance to the analytics and emotions of covering Big Blue. Here are your hosts, Adam Armbrecht and Andy Makowicz.
Yes, friends, on a Friday morning, it is OGP live on YouTube with myself, of course, Adam Armbrecht, and over there, the healthy, wealthy, and wise, Andy Makowicz, although, just to qualify this a little bit, wealthy and wise, always the case, but healthy is usually the kind of the outlier sometimes for you, Andy.
Yeah, I feel like this is a recurring theme. Either I'm hungover or I'm getting, bad reactions from the first vaccine that I got for COVID. No matter what it is, I'm usually like debilitated on the Friday morning show. This happens to be the latter, where I'm just finally recovering from getting my most recent shot. So, but I'm here. The dog days of right before the draft are here for us, Adam. What are we talking about today?
That's the thing, right? There was so much excitement, so much buzz around free agency. A lot of the signings that the Giants made and some of the big splashes, and those were great to cover. And then to think about how it can impact the draft. I ran a mock draft behind your back when you were late last night while you were asleep. Adam Armbrecht was doing mock drafts to big success and rave reviews from the fans. But now we are kind of in this little lull, and I think it's going to really start to pick up here as April gets underway. And by the way, it is April now, and we'll start to get those conversations around, prospects that are being brought in and being interviewed and discussed, and hearing those little trickle downs of where teams are starting to think about going in specific rounds. But in the interim, we did hear a couple of things off the top. The New York Giants, they went out and they signed another 2 cornerbacks off the Tennessee Titans, young players. When you look at that room, because I just want to get this out of the way, it's not the biggest story in the world, but I think they have like 8 or 9 cornerbacks on the roster now. Combined with the Dory Jackson, obviously the big name being brought in, do you look at that and say, hey, Yadam, Sam Beal, you guys are as low on the totem pole as anybody coming into this offseason, coming out of the draft, etc., because it feels a little bit like volume shooter in terms of how they want to develop the depth, but we know you're not carrying 8 or 9 DBs. You're going to get yourself down to 5 at the most, you would think, given that you also have a lot of depth in the secondary there with Peppers and McKinney and of course Logan Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, look, they brought in a couple of younger players from Tennessee. I don't even know if the contracts are guaranteed. This feels like you bring in some people to light a fire and create some competition, which I think is good for the Giants. We've kind of just said we don't have enough good players at cornerback for quite a while. Now we have 9 guys that are all going to compete. And, we know that there's going to be potentially 3 guys in Adoree Jackson, James Bradbury, and Darnay Holmes that are absolutely 100% locked into some kind of contributing role this year. The other 6 guys, it's going to be a dogfight. I mean, when you talk about Sam Beal, we don't know what we're getting from Sam Beal. He hasn't been with the team in over a year, and even before that, injury-plagued season. So for me, I love that we're bringing in more and more competition. It's been quite a long time since we said, wow, we have too many players, too much depth at a certain position. So let's go ahead and get as many players as we can and figure it out later.
You also brought in another tight end, by the way, which I know is Andy Makowitz's favorite thing to do, in Cole Hikutini. Nice little 26-year-old, 6'4", 240-pounder. Don't know what to make out of that. Just another tight end in the room as well. And then it was, of course, cornerback Chris Milton. They also brought in safety Joshua Kalu as well. I think you're right, though. I mean, none of these things, when it's kind of these footnote pickups here in free agency, none of these ones are set off alarm bells as, oh, that must mean X, right? Look at the roster and tell me that this guy's here, this guy's going to be gone. The only player I think out of that group that it signals for me based on what these contracts could look like would be a player like Yadam, who hadn't a respectable season for us, but does count for a little over $2 million on the books this year. And if it's all, apples to apples, hey, this guy's going to cost me just over $1 million. You cost me just over $2 million. Thanks so much. We hope you find a nice landing spot is maybe the case there.
Yeah, Yadam is an interesting case because he did play better the second half of the year. You saw flashes of what the Denver Broncos drafted him for originally. He was able to not get burned in coverage like he was early on in the year. I thought he was going to be 2 or 3 games in, and then the Giants were going to cut him. He ended up playing serviceable towards the back end. But again, as you said, they could free up almost $2 million of cap space. that's cap space that we need because according to, Over the Cap and other places, the Giants still need to free up some cap room to sign their draft picks that are coming up. But what's even more interesting, Adam, is we talk about pecking order of these players. We could go out and there could be a veteran that is released from any one of these teams or a veteran free agent that we would sign immediately that would push half of this list down, and that person will presumably take a roster spot from us.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest piece of it. When you see some of these other signings, you go, that's the perfect point, because I think that the Giants are still going to be in on veteran talent that gets cut and released from other places based on their drafts classes and how they fill out their rosters and based on what their expectations are for their season. Right, bad teams are going to be cutting talent because we're in a rebuild, and the Giants are somewhere above, we think, the basement, but we're not in the penthouse just yet. So there's going to be talent in that range, and then really good teams are also going to be saying, yeah, we're just so overloaded with talent that we're actually going to be cutting players that would be improvements for other teams around the league. So stuff to keep on an eye on there for sure. It'll be interesting to see how long it takes as we work our way towards the draft and then coming out of it to see some of those cuts come around. The other quick thing I wanted to touch on here, because the meat and potatoes of this episode is, of course, going to be the offensive line. We cannot do it. It's our thing. We like the offensive line, and there's some real meat on that bone to discuss around how the Giants should be approaching the draft and finalizing this offensive line heading into the season. But Todd Mcshea came out, and I don't know why I titled this Todd Mcshea's mockery. I mean, I think it's clever, sort of, but it also makes it seem like I'm insulting the man. He had his, I think, 4.0 mock draft came out, and at 11, he had the Giants trading back with the New England Patriots and then ultimately taking Koromoa, the linebacker, to help fill out this defense. Do you think that that's a reasonable expectation there? In that scenario, it was Justin Fields who's there at 11, but I just wonder if the Giants are willing to trade down, if they wouldn't even maybe be willing to trade further than just 15, right? Depending on who else might be interested. A team like Chicago that may want to come up for a quarterback. Trying to think of some other teams there in around the 20s that might be interested. How likely do you think it is, even for the Patriots, that they would come up for the quarterback at that spot and give the Giants maybe an opportunity to grab a couple extra picks? Because that's what I ran through in my mock scenario, was a trade down. And the interesting thing about it was you can do the trade down or not and still grab significant value at key positions. Obviously, you get a couple extra players by doing it, but I don't know if it's a necessity for the Giants. So where do you think they lie in terms of their perspective on those players in that range at 11 and their value versus ones that are closer to the 20s?
So there's another piece of this that I think is important to note is the Patriots have the 15th pick. You would presume that trading up to 11, that pick would have to be included. And then you wonder to yourself, well, what is the other capital that the Patriots are going to give the Giants to sweeten the deal, make sure that the Giants get their fair value? If you go to Walter Football and you use the point system that I think Jimmy Johnson created decades ago, basically that pick is worth 200. The swap from 11 to 15 is worth about 200 points in the system. Now you may say, 200 points, what is that? Like 2 billion? Like what does that even mean? It's the equivalent of the 78th pick in the third round. So the question that I think I'll turn back to you is, if you have Rashawn Slater or Penei Sewell or one of the wide receivers that you like, or someone that's there at 11, and you trade out to 15, are any of those players still going to be there for you? And is the trade-off from those types of players to the next batch of players worth an additional third round pick?
Yeah, and it's a fair question. And when I've done a couple of these mocks, and I think even in these scenarios, right, like you say Slater, even Mika Parsons, right? What if he's there? What does he represent to the defensive side of the ball versus the extra piece that you may be able to get? So whether it's getting another offensive lineman, whether it's being able to bring in maybe a wide receiver weapon a little bit earlier, the dance that the reason why I wonder if it's worth it is because the dance that you end up doing is saying, okay, we trade down to 15 and there we take player X, right? And a lot of these scenarios, you end up maybe taking a look at a guy like Vera Tucker because he'll be the next offensive lineman that you might target. So you take him at 15. You have these extra picks, but what you maybe end up doing is then packaging and moving up to target another player. And it just, it's a weird combination of, well, then who could you have taken? Say it could have been Slater at 11, right? Well, you don't take Slater at 11. You drop back, you end up taking Vera Tucker. You think there's maybe a slight drop off there in terms of the talent. And now you feel compelled to try to get up and target a guy to get the most value that you possibly can, as opposed to if you took Slater at 11, then you'd maybe just stand pat and feel comfortable not needing to move. You get the extra asset, but really only to help maybe recoup some of the value that you lost by trading down in the first place. So it does make my mind swirl a little bit. I love a good trade down, but it does make me wonder. And I think the one instance that I did get excited about, and unfortunately for Joseph Clark, who follows us pretty consistently on YouTube, in the last mock, not to go down the road too much, in a trade down, I ended up there with multiple second round picks and third round picks, and what it was the second and then the multiple thirds, and Joseph Osai and then also Tryon were both there. So I doubled down in this edge rusher role and said, hey, we're going to get dynamic and energetic and what have you. Even in getting both of those players, when I went back and watched some tape on them, when I went back and reread some of the profiles on them, one player in Tryon is going to be a little bit more developmental, and I knew that may need the year to get there, and that's okay. And then even just watching the tape on Osai, I thought, well, he's not quite as quick, doesn't quite have the hip twitchiness, whatever. So yeah, I got these two players, but are they as good as maybe getting Kwity Paye in the first round? Right? Like, so volume, you can't just be a volume shooter. It has to be that the holes that they plug and the skill set that they have are going to be worth spending then multiple picks on those guys.
Yeah, and that's why this whole offseason we said Dave Gettleman has never traded back. This would be a perfect time for them to trade back. Now I'm doing a complete 180, and I'm coming to the point where I'm like, is it worth it to trade back? If we're only getting an additional third round pick from someone like the Patriots, and we move back 4 spots, and all of the premier offensive tackles and Parsons is gone, and all of the other players that are considered the best player at their position, is it really worth it? And then to your point, then all of a sudden you get trigger happy and you're like, man, there's a wide receiver we really want in the second round. Let's package our second round pick and our 2 third round picks and move up and get that guy. I kind of like the idea of standing pat, taking the best player available at 11, and then figuring out how that shapes the rest of the draft. And the reason is the Giants set themselves up in free agency to be able to do this. That's the whole point. They went out and they got a number 1 wide receiver in Kenny Golladay. They have shored up different positions, like, cornerback is not that big of a need with Adoree Jackson now. We mentioned 9 guys on the roster. The Giants, other than offensive line, don't have a screaming position that they need help in. So if any of the offensive linemen are there at 11, I think you got to pull the trigger, and then, that'll set up the rest of the draft where you can just take best player available.
And that's where the debate begins now. As we transition to what we said, this is the bulk of the episode here. It is the offensive line. It's the debate of how to complete this line, how to construct it. So let's start at a baseline here. Currently on our offensive line, we have Andrew Thomas, we have Shane Lemieux, we have Nick Gates, we have Hunk, and then we have Pert, right? We don't know what's going to be in there at the right guard position, but that's currently what we have. And then obviously we brought in a couple of veterans that you can plug in at right guard potentially. Obviously we still have Nate Solder. But you and I said this before we got started here. The first component to this that dictates some things and does make me wonder as far as a trade down scenario would go. There is a world where I think it would make sense if a player like Pert, who played over 13 games in college at guard, is maybe a candidate to start at right guard. And this, I hate to do it, but it could be a feather in Andy Makowitz's cap that the world where they've kept Nate Solder could be saying, hey, he's played tackle. Obviously, we're putting him over on the right side. Maybe he can be the bridge to a tackle we draft this year, and Pert can kick inside and get a look at guard. And this would be instead of, say, a Will Hernandez, who could become the cap casualty to help free up the draft class money that we're going to need. How would that feel to you? What would that look like to you? And if you had your druthers, would you prefer to have Will Hernandez getting a shot at right guard, or would you prefer to see Matt Pert getting that look? We're just going to bring Andy back in off of mute real quick.
Yeah, that would be probably the smart thing to do, Adam.
Unless you're concerned about your thoughts. You don't want to overexpose yourself.
Well, everyone knows how I feel about Will Hernandez. So you saying that name, I just hit the mute button and started cursing and screaming uncontrollably.
Sure.
I think Hernandez is a backup guard. He proved through the first 6-8 games of the season. We've talked about how Solder played left tackle, Andrew Thomas played left tackle. Everyone looked terrible. The only consistent person there was Will Hernandez. I think he needs to be a backup guard. I do like the upside of Shane Lemieux. He obviously struggled in some of the play that he had, but I'd like to see if he can develop more like Nick Gates has, getting some experience. To me, I actually really don't mind the idea of Pert swinging inside. I mean, like I said, you're keeping Solder on a cheap deal. He has a ton of experience. You got to keep him around because this line is so young. When you look across the board, after Nate Solder, Hernandez, being 3 years is basically the most experienced guy when you think about the starters. For me, I like the idea of Pert maybe going inside and competing at guard. You mentioned that he played it in college. It's why, in my opinion, if we can get a guy like Slater at 11, it allows the Giants to figure out the right combination at right tackle and not just have to throw people there and say, good luck, let's hope it all works out.
And as it stands right now, Zach Fulton gets earmarked, the free agent that we brought in to be, he's the veteran 29-year-old. We brought him in. He would maybe be the guy that plugs in there at the right guard spot, at least at the beginning of the season. And the only thing that I would say is in regards to, you mentioned Slater, to me, from everything that you read, this is a guy that played tackle, but you want him to kick inside, right? That's what he can be, a good tackle and a dominant guard. Now, I do push back on a little bit on the idea that there are certain players that maybe don't have the skill, the size, right? The measurables to play on the outside. If that's the case with Slater or any of these prospects, and you say, the reason why we say kick inside to guard to be dominant is because the college level is slightly smaller than the overall size of the game at the NFL level. Okay. If it's just that you think it's going to take him a little bit longer at tackle to really become dominant, so it's going to take the year and he's going to have some ups and downs, then I don't care. Because it's about long-term, right? I only want to kick him into guard if you're saying, it could be a so-so tackle because he's a little bit undersized. You kick him into guard, watch out, this guy's going to be a bulldozer. So I do wonder how the Giants look at a prospect like that. Vera Tucker is another one a little bit further down in the draft in the first round there that also people say kick him into guard. But here's my couple of pieces. One, Shane Lemieux, we're no more committed to him than anything else. He's a 5th round pick. We like what he flashed, just like with Pert, right? He drafted in the 3rd round. I think if you said coming in, what would be the ideal role for Pert over the first couple of seasons? Backup swing tackle, maybe develops into a starter at some point, right? So the fact that he flashed last season and gave us this taste is exciting, but it also doesn't mean that we should be hot committed on this. Because I even think, coming into last year, when we drafted Andrew Thomas, we were like, well, that's it. Check the box. We drafted, we fixed the line. Like you get really excited about that. And then even for a 1st round pick. And by the way, some people asked on Twitter, if you could go back and redo the number 4 pick last year, who would you draft? And I immediately said Andrew Thomas, because I still love Andrew Thomas. I still think he's going to be a phenomenal left tackle. And he showed that by the back end of this past season, but it does take time to develop these guys. The one world where I think trading down would be possible, and where you can go with, say, a Mika Parsons at 11 and just stand pat with no trade downs, is looking into the 2nd round. And you talk about a college that has really produced a lot of stellar offensive linemen in recent memory. And that's the Fighting Irish of Notre Dame. And that's, of course, Liam Echenberg. Now, he is listed as a pure offensive tackle. There is no kick in for him. You're going to line him up there. And even, by all accounts, they say starting left tackle. Now, do I think that you can switch a guy over to right tackle? Probably. 6'6", 305. The guy is a mountain of a man. I would sit there and maybe say, I'll even go as far as this, because I didn't even say this to you in our pre-recording conversation. There's a world where I would take Slater, and if I could get, or in, say, the trade down, if I could trade back and grab an extra pick, I'll take Vera Tucker and I'll plug him in at right guard. And then if I come up and I think that Echenberg can really be a stud, I'm going to take him. So regardless of any double downs or anything, even if I take Mika Parsons in the 1st round, when I come up in the 2nd round, if Liam Echenberg is there for me, I might take him. I might take him and I'll say, okay, listen, does that mean that he's going to switch over to right tackle? Great. Does that mean that Pert has to try to compete for guard or be our backup swing tackle? And maybe Soldier's going to plug in, or maybe Fulton, the veteran, is going to be at right guard. Maybe. But nothing is going to stop me from taking what a lot of people are regarding as a premier offensive tackle talent in Echenberg, who could even rise to the back end of the first round. But if we're in a world where he falls there, I think the Giants might jump at that because it would be another very dominant offensive tackle to add to the line.
Here's the thing that people keep forgetting. The Giants' offensive line was dreadful last year. Like it was ostensibly horrible, right? And and we think, okay, well, Nate Solder's coming back. Like, what have we done so far this offseason? We have released Kevin Zeitler, who had an average year, but was probably our best offensive lineman over the course of the season. And we have Nate Solder coming back after opting out. Don't know what we're going to see from him. We can't just think similarly to last year, oh, you just get Andrew Thomas and the offensive line is going to be fine. You need to start addressing all of these positions and double down and sometimes triple down on making the team better. If we can get an offensive tackle and a guard within the first 2 picks, and we say, well, now we don't have to decide between Shane Lemieux and Will Hernandez, or now we don't have to pray and hope that Nate Solder is going to come back and be a serviceable right tackle, even though he hasn't played that since year 1 in New England. Like, sign me up for that. I'm all for just getting the line better. And yes, there are other areas of need around this team. We talk about defensive end. We need an edge rusher. We need some kind of player that can get to the quarterback. But we are investing so much in Daniel Jones's success this year. I would put all my chips into the middle of the table if you told me we could go guard tackle with the first 2 picks and just say, we've addressed it. We now have everything that we need. Let's figure out who goes where now. Yeah.
No, and by the way, a guy like Fulton, we said he brought him in here. You go by whatever metric you want. He's ceilinged out at 63 on a PFF, right? So that doesn't give you a ton of confidence there. And then you're talking about having 5th rounders, etc. Sorry, this caught my eye in the background that when you go over to ESPN, you look at their depth chart. They have Nate Solder starting at left tackle with Andrew Thomas backing him up. That's obviously not the case.
Someone might want to update that.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, I'm pretty disgusted by the idea that that's the way that ESPN wants to present their information. But I think you're right. And the big step back picture here of, well, as we come into this draft, we know we still want to get an edge rusher, and that's great. In the mock that I did, by the way, the 2 6th-round picks, I took offensive linemen. I took developmental guard tackles that were projected to be able to develop into starters, may need a nice year, even a little bit more to develop. But the thinking was, it wasn't even about that these guys will be a starter one day, 6th-round picks. It was that our offensive line, we had backups. 2 years ago, we had backups starting for us, right? So it's not just who's starting. And this, even last year, Shane Lemieux, I don't know that he's 100% a starter in this league. He's a 5th-round pick. Can he develop? Yes. But I'm not going to lock myself into him. So bringing in more bodies, bringing in more competition, and seeing, including Nate Solder, who I think, depending on how camp plays out, depending on how the draft goes, he's going to be another cut candidate to free up money. Because even though they restructured him, he still represents enough money on the books that if you need to create the room, you could. For all of my, negative connotations that I've attached to Nate Solder and his play, I do like the idea of having the veteran on this team. I do like having that experience and helping the young players develop. So I'm fine keeping him, but it will be interesting how that money shakes out. But ultimately, yeah, so that's why I wanted to bring that up about what if it was no trade downs and you go Slater at 11 and Echenberg at, whatever ends up being 42, right? I don't. At first when I thought about it, I was like, maybe, wow, that'd be surprising. And then I took a beat and thought, yeah, but I'd probably be pretty excited about it too, right?
Well, the other piece of it, Adam, I feel the same way about wide receiver. I've kind of done a little bit of a 180 on this as well. Our wide receiving core was not great last year. Like, it just wasn't. Like, Golden Tate was not good. And Sterling Shepard was somewhat injured. Darius Slayton had some really good games, and then he would just have games where he would have literally zero catches. And so if you said draft a wide receiver, if there's still one of the big 4 wide receiver playmakers available at 11, I'm okay with taking one of those wide receivers at 11. People may say, well, then you got to push Darius Slayton out of the lineup, or it changes how we do things. fine. Like, we need to just get better across the board. And like, if we can find a guy that is a playmaker that's on a rookie contract that'll be here for a few years, I am fine with that. No one is safe on this roster. If we can get better at any position by taking someone, and it means we push a guy that we kind of like down the pecking order a little bit, then that's what we have to do.
Well, then, okay, good, because then we can close out the show disagreeing, because I'd hate to just go through the entire week and not have it be that we don't have a problem with one another. I would still strongly push back against it. So again, in these mock scenarios, the players that I would stay right there would be Kyle Pitsy, Happel, right? Very easy to say that. Interestingly enough, I did have Slater as being like, this is the no nonsense, don't mess around, you don't even listen to anybody. Maybe there is, depending on the scenario, where I would allow the tantalizing nature of him to entice someone to come up. I also don't think that he's going to be there, so it's kind of easy to live in those waters. Mika Parsons is a guy that I think could be very enticing to a lot of teams, even like the Miami Dolphins, who are going to be at 18 after they pick at 6 as well. You know, a team like that wants to improve the defensive side of the ball. Maybe you can get a nice amount of return having a team come up 7 picks. But from the wide receiver perspective, and this is the reason why I push back on it, is because even if you stood pat and you made it all the way to the 3rd round, you're still like, even in the 3rd round, there's going to be wide receivers that can be dynamic. One of the ones that I ended up looking at, and I wish now I'm going to lose his name here as we come up, but like Sage Surratt has fallen oddly, right? And he was a little bit higher on draft boards. Maybe he's a guy that ends up being available there in the 3rd round. Guys like Tyler Vaughn, guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown. There's a name that I have very much been excited about and I think could be available all the way into the 3rd round. And then I'll even go one step further with it and say players that are not wide receivers but are dynamic playmakers, like a Kenneth Gainwell. Because I do agree with you. There's no reason not to bring in more talent. If you can go and bring in a guy who, by all scouting reports, they say this kid could have entered the draft as a slot receiver. That could be his career at the NFL, and he would be dynamic. Instead, he's going to be able to do return game. He's going to be able to line up in the slot. He's also going to be able to be supplemental in the backfield. And I like that because you're checking multiple boxes. I think you can get away with it. And most Giants fans are going to, one, agree with you that wide receiver should be on the table at 11, especially if it's Waddle. I think a lot of people be excited about that. So they're going to agree with you in that regard. And then I think at the very least, they're going to say, if not the 1st round, though, you got to have it on the board in the 2nd round. And there is a drop off there. There is a difference between some of that, high end 2nd round talent when you're thinking about guys, the Tylan Wallace, a Rondell Moore, a Tutu Atwell. Bateman is not going to be there. Looks like he had a very solid 40 time at his pro day to kind of solidify that he can be dynamic. Terrence Marshall's definitely going to get up into that 1st round. Now the Ravens have to be a little bit concerned that he's not just going to comfortably fall to them there at the back of the 1st. I think he's going to push up a little bit too. So there is a drop off, that is clear and understood, but I think combining it with what you're saying, and maybe it's fair because Darius Slayton was also a 5th round pick, so you don't have to be beholden to him. I maybe would like to see Darius Slayton with Shepard, with Golladay, right? And I feel good about that, along with Evan Ingram if he's there, and along with obviously Kyle Rudolph as well. So I don't want to touch the dynamic that much yet. And I'd be okay with a 3rd round wide receiver supplementing. But as often happens, I circle myself to at least the idea of and I understand it. I may disagree, but I do understand the logic of it.
Well, because the other thing I think about in my head is if we draft Slater, and to your point, people are talking about moving him to inside to guard. I think to myself, couldn't we just take another dynamic playmaker at 11 and find a guard in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th round? And like with that trade-off, what would you rather have? Would you rather have Slater and a later round wide receiver, or would you rather have a dynamic playmaker and then pick any guard that's at the top of the list, best player available later on? And I think we have lost Adam. I think the challenge that Adam and I have that's kind of the stark difference in all this is that he feels pretty content with the additions of John Ross being there as well. Kind of feels like the wide receiver group is solidified. I think we have to get better at every single one of these positions, as we mentioned before. It's really been a challenge for the Giants on the outside. This is a make or break year for Daniel Jones. They went out and they've gotten Kyle Rudolph. They went out and got Kenny Galladay. We should be giving this offense, which scored 17 points a game last year, every opportunity to make big plays and win. We've gotten a little different on defense. We certainly haven't filled the holes of Dexter Lawrence leaving the Giants. So for me, I think about it, we have to be able to put up points, manufacture points. We know in the division, Dallas is going to be able to score points. We don't really know what Washington's going to do. They have an amazing defense. We know Philadelphia is kind of in a rebuild mode. So all in all, for me, I'm okay with offensive line or wide receiver. I don't think we should really get too cute with the pick and trade back and then hope that someone is going to be there. I think overall, we just make the best of it and go from there. You can always follow us on social media, One Giant Podcast. Go rate, review, subscribe, do everything that you need. And as I always want, need, and demand you to know, as always, let's go Big Blue.